Well, thank you everyone for coming to this virtual book signing and talk with Edward Snink. And I've worked with Ed since I think 2017 because the first edition was published in 2018. And we worked on it for quite a while before that was published. And then I've been working continuously with Ed since then. It's been an honor. And this new revision that Daniel really helped drive came on really quick. And I think the timing for it is great, given the fact that a lot of people are being thrust into this caregiving role. But just briefly about myself. So I'm a publishing consultant. I live in Morro Bay. I've been doing this since 2009, working with authors like Ed, helping them through the whole process of getting their books published. And then now a big part of it is the marketing and all the things that go after. It's one of these things. I read a very interesting quote just this morning about how a project, the longer it goes, the bigger it gets, like the more complicated any project gets. So if you can imagine the layers that we've gone through with Ed, because he's been doing this continuously for so long, and now we're on the second edition. We've got a hardcover, paperback, the ebook. He's working on online courses. He's been getting speaking engagements and podcasts and the website and blogging and it just goes on and on. So I hand it to Ed because it's not easy to be an author. So Ed, why don't you just share a little bit about yourself for the folks that might be watching this that in the future that don't know about you?
Well, I think most of you know that I have over 45 years in healthcare. And because of that, I have come to an awareness of all the ins and outs, and the issues are always the same. You know, they never change. They're always the same. You know, well, let's talk about stress, or let's talk about this, or let's talk about that. And I just decided, I mean, I have a background in counseling psychology and also in my PhD in depth psychology and mythology studies. And I was gifted at Pacifica to be able to share, here comes someone else, to share the fact that I was able to be able to put into perspective what I have learned. I want to introduce Dr. Aaron Bright, who's teaching a class tonight, and he is the author of When Caregiving Calls, which we're going to talk about later. And he wanted to have his class participate in this discussion. So thank you, Aaron. I appreciate it very much.
Oh, you bet.
Hey, Aaron.
Hey, Dennis. I actually let them go, so there's nobody here but me. I'm in an empty classroom now.
Lucky for you, it's being recorded, so they can watch it later.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we're just talking about some of my background, and I used to belong to a community of brothers, and I learned from them the gift of hospitality, the gift of being able to listen and to be able to open up and form not only relationships with those that I care with, but also to be able to understand what's going on inside of me because of that relationship. That I call that the third level of hospitality. The first has to do with, you know, I welcome the stranger. So all caregivers welcome the stranger. The second is you sort of develop a relationship with them. And because of that relationship, you listen to the stories. And once a person feels they're heard, then they're able to move into a process of self-care. But the third level was what happens to me because of that relationship. And that's what I think most caregivers don't spend enough time. They don't spend enough time to debrief. They don't spend enough time to reflect on what did that experience teach me, both positively and negatively. It may have brought up a wound in me that I didn't want to look at. And that person was a mirror to me that said, Edward, maybe you need to look at this part of your life that you haven't looked at. it may be the joy of knowing that you really made a difference in a person's life. And I had this experience today over someone that I went to the Home Depot, and I got some very heavy bags of crystals for our water softener. And someone in the lot came and said, "Can I help you put them in the car?" And I said, thank you for being so kind. And he said, "Oh, it's just my job." But I wanted, it was so classic, "It's just my job." And what happens is that cultural dismissal of, "Oh, well, thank you. I really appreciate doing this for you," so that he could own it. And when you own those experiences, you prevent compassion fatigue and burnout.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Ed. That's something we can talk about more. But so the timing of your first edition, 2018, seemed very timely when it came out, as people were being thrust into this caregiving role. And who would have known with COVID that it would be even more important? But tell us about how the timing of this revised edition is so important.
Well, COVID has had an effect on all of us. I think if we ask ourselves, when we try to seek the normal, is it the same normal as it was, almost 2 years ago? And most of us will say, "I learned something during this time, and I myself have changed." And so because the beginning of National Healthcare Caregivers Month, I thought it was opportune to present this launch, because I want to reach out to those who are suffering from compassion fatigue. And I want them to know they're not alone. And I have changed. I have changed during this time. And I'm interested in hearing how each of you have changed, or how the person I'm dealing with has changed. Just to acknowledge that, the normal that I seek isn't the normal that I've been at. It's certainly different. And I know that because I'm different. I became more focused. I became more, I'll use the word contemplative or reflective. And I remember Brian saying to me, "Ed, we should have a hard copy of your book." Well, that just opened up a Pandora's box. Well, what does that mean? Well, okay, I'm going to ask for some information. I'm going to ask for some input. And the more input I got, the more I was really motivated to go that way. It wasn't hard work. It just kept coming and coming and coming. And then when I was introduced to Daniel, through a professor that said, "Ed, you really got to focus on X, Y, and Z." And I have a best friend who used to teach English at in Brooklyn, head of the English department, and he said, "Ed, there's so many, you use the word that so many times." Well, Daniel said, "Ed, I went through the book and there were 200 that's that I eliminated." So both Chris Downing and Bill Devine were helpful to me. And then with Aaron, and then going back with Brian, it just became a work of love. I just enjoyed doing it.
Well, and we'll mention that it is a major revision. It's not a minor revision by any means. And Daniel did put a lot of time and energy into it. And indeed, it's the work that Ed can feel is his best. I think that's what you told me, is this is what you are truly proud of, like at a much higher level than even before, that this is such a definitive work for you and a contribution to caregiving. So I hope the world embraces it, because it's a great resource. But as we know, getting it in front of everybody is sometimes hard with a lot of noise that we have. But I know you're a hard worker, Ed. You talk about the distinction between caregivers and caretakers. Can you share a little bit more about that?
When you hear those two words, just listen, caregiver and caretaker. Caregiver is very relational and personal. A caregiver enjoys what they do and they are fed by their experiences. A caretaker is one that just does the job. That person may be at the height of compassion fatigue or burnout, and they go to work and they hate it. They hate working, not because of their original calling, but they're just totally exhausted. They become the caretaker. And it's a lack of personal integration with the work. That's the difference I discovered in this research for this revision. So most caregivers really enjoy their work. They're just exhausted and they need a helping hand. And we talked earlier about, the cost of healthcare. There's a term that's used called cost avoidance. So for example, if nurses and doctors are leaving the profession today, what can the institutions do to prevent them from leaving? Because the cost of keeping them is less than the cost of hiring a new person. So if there's money involved, if that's the big issue, well, we can hire coaches. We can develop a program in which we can understand the different traumas that caregivers experience. Their experiences are normal to traumatic experiences. So for example, in California last year, there was this horrible fire, and I think 80 people were killed in this fire. It was called the Paradise Fire. Maybe because they were all going to paradise, I don't know, but the town was called Paradise. Imagine being a first responder. Imagine being a doctor or nurse at that time, or the fire people, or the police officers. I'm sure they experienced tremendous trauma because of that. Who cares for them? It's like, I don't know what's being done there, but that's just a radical example of, get on with it, get on to the next job, get on to the next call. And we don't have time to sit and reflect.
Process.
So
yeah, that was a rural community. So I imagine that the resources were completely inundated and overwhelmed when they got hit with that kind of a impact. It's just like it would be, if it happened here in San Luis Obispo, it would be a disaster. I mean, we don't have a huge system. We don't have a lot of ICU beds. I mean, we are in a situation, and I know Paradise up by Chico is in the same boat, that I'm sure it was way more than those people were prepared to ever deal with. So interesting.
So the point is that caregivers experience, their experience is normal to traumatic events. It's normal for them to have these extraordinary reactions because we're human.
Okay. Ed, in this revision too, you go into detail regarding the 3 cultural taboos that are preventing caregivers from seeking self-care. And that's pretty important because that means we have to overcome kind of the popular norm, or what we were sort of conditioned. Can you talk a little bit about what those are?
Well, self-care is countercultural. So we'll just start there. I was writing an article called "Don't Blame Caregivers for Their Lack of Self-Care," it's not their fault. So the first cultural taboo is caregivers themselves have difficulty in trusting their experiences about traumatic events. And they have difficulty in trusting one of their colleagues in saying what's really going on. Because what usually happens, and it happened to me in my former employment, was that when you start saying, I'm having an issue, they think you're mentally ill. That's the biggest taboo, or the biggest detriment in seeking self-care. And so their peers think that they're not good enough. There must be something wrong with them, that they can't handle what's going on. You know, big, strong people, you know, we have to cope with the traumas that's going on. And if you can't do that, you're a weak person. I remember talking to one of the physicians I interviewed, and I said to him, you know, he was in charge of a large neonatal care unit, which is very traumatic. And there's a lot of death in neonatal units, even though there's a lot of miracles. So I said to him, do you talk about your experiences with your peers, meaning the other doctors and part of that team? And he said, if I did, they would think I was a bad physician. It's just so real. So they don't talk, they don't trust. And the second is they don't talk about their experience. How many of us really have someone to talk to when we're dealing with some real deep issues that affect us in caregiving, or just our own personal lives? Do we trust someone enough to be able to say, you know, that experience, you know, I was at that automobile accident, and, you know, seeing that person killed just really affected me. So the second taboo is not telling your story, but also not being heard. So when you tell a story, you're able to share your life experience. This is my life experience, and I'm hoping you hear me. I don't want advice. I don't want someone telling me what to do. I want you to hear me. So you talk about hospitality in the other, being able to create the space to listen and hear. So that's the second taboo. And also, because there is this taboo of not talking about your experience, that leads to compassion fatigue and burnout. The third is you don't talk about your feelings. I mean, something may make us extremely angry, and we want to share how angry we are. Well, have any of us learned growing up how to deal with anger? There's anger everywhere, but did we deal with it? You know, were we able to say, you know, when I hear that, that really makes me angry. Oh, well, tell me about it. Well, or what about, you know, this sense we have to stuff our feelings. Leave your emotions outside, you know, outside your work. Well, we can't do that because we're human. And if we're human, we have emotions. And so even that is a cultural taboo. You know, stuff your feelings, you know, stiff upper lip, you know, big boys don't cry, and big girls, are too emotional. They're both wrong, because we do have emotions. And how do we go to our buddies, our coach, a friend, a spouse, and say, I'm really having trouble over this. Will you listen to me? It makes me irritated. I feel fearful. I don't know what to do. In our culture, we have to be always perfect. Is there anyone here perfect? Raise your hand. Okay. And when I used to do in-service for new employees, and we had a value of excellence, I would say, is there anyone here perfect? No one raised their hand. And then I would say, and don't we hate the people who think they are? So we're not perfect, but our culture demands that we have to be perfect in all we do. Well, that's enough to lead you to jumping off a cliff. And the rate of suicide is increased among caregivers. And I would think it's because who will listen? Who could they go to? How do we change that paradigm, instead of excluding someone who might have an issue over an experience, instead of welcoming them? About 6 months ago, Lester Holt interviewed a captain of a police force somewhere in Illinois. And the captain said, I'm suffering from PTSD, and I want everyone in this department to know I'm suffering, because I don't want to be alone anymore. And what he set up in his department was that the norm would be that they would share their experiences when they met, that they wouldn't exclude one another, that they would welcome, that the actual healing for each of them was the team. The team became the group that would help each other, support each other, instead of excluding them. That's the paradigm I like to change. Enforce.
I like that. And it made me think about isolation and the fact that people feel like failures. If you can't deal with it, you feel like a failure. And if you continually feel like a failure, well, you don't feel valued to the world anymore. And I imagine that leads people down that horrible path. But so related to that, Ed, is compassion fatigue, which I know you talk a lot about, but what are the warning signs? And then how does one avoid this trap?
Well, compassion fatigue is really a workplace. I'm trying to think of the right word. A workplace.
Hazard?
Is
it a hazard? A workplace hazard?
Yes. All caregivers experience compassion fatigue because they care. So there's a normal sense. Parents care for their children and grandchildren. Educators care for their students. Adult children care for their parents who need help. Doctors care for their patients, nurses care for theirs, therapists, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's the norm. So the norm is to care, but the norm also is that you may suffer in your caring. So that's a whole nother existential notion to deal with that, because what parent doesn't suffer with teenage children? That it's a normal reaction. And so we're able to recognize that. But compassion fatigue is when it gets to a point of exhaustion. How many caregivers say they're just exhausted? They don't know what to do. They're living on burnt energy. And I had that experience, and I went to this kind, wonderful Jesuit counselor, and I asked him, after a month, I said, I don't think this is going to end soon. And he said, he said no. And we talked about that. And then I said, on a scale of 1 to 10, where am I? And he said, you're between 8 and 9, and I consider 10 irreversible. I didn't know that, but I knew something in me needed help. So that's the key. I think most of us know we need help, but we don't know where to go. And that led me into the understanding of what addiction's about. Addiction really is an attempt to heal. They're just using the wrong method. And it develops into, physiological, besides the psychological effects. But the person is looking to be healed. So how do you turn that around and allow yourself to say, you can be healed? And I always say, look at me.
You're living proof. Well, it's interesting. Yeah, the addictions, and I think we're addicted to distraction because the world has so much to distract us from facing the reality of what we're dealing with. And I think that's how a lot of us are coping with this new normal, is we can be distracted till the end of time, thanks to Netflix and all the streaming services and the internet that never seems to end the questions that are asked. But that's, and so the warning signs are you have to just really be listening. It's basically what you're saying. You need to be checking in with yourself.
Well, and you also find yourself emotionally unstable. You
getting short with people.
You find yourself not being able to listen, or you're not sleeping well. You might have different somatic experiences, and they're warning signs. Again, as Daniel said earlier, we have to get in touch with our bodies. Our bodies tell us what's happening. And in our Puritan culture, it's difficult to sit back and go, I just really love who I am. And there's a verse in one of the Psalms, you knit me in your mother's womb, and wonderful are your works, O Lord. How many of us woke up this morning, looked in the mirror and said, wonderful are your works, O Lord, instead of the bulges or, what's happening, or the skin changes, but we can acknowledge that, we are wonderful. And it's very difficult. It's taken me years to acknowledge that I'm wonderfully gifted and I love who I am.
I like that. So in honor of the fact this is the first day of National Caregivers Month, and since we've got Aaron Blight on the call, I did want to draw your attention to a promotion that we put up on Ed's website just for the month of November. Ed is bundling his book with When Caregiving Calls for a deep discounted price. He's just bumped up the price a little bit over his book. And he's also offering signed copies of his book today. So if you go to this virtual book signing, would be exactly what he does in a bookstore, which is he would be signing copies and selling them to you. So all you need to do is go to soulofcaregiving.com. But part of that bundled opportunity is, this is a great opportunity with Aaron on the phone to tell us a little bit about When Caregiving Calls. And Aaron, I'll tell you, I did recommend your book to a friend. My wife's cousin got stage 4 cancer last year, and her boyfriend at the time, they're now married, was thrust into this role of full-time caregiver. In fact, he quit his job to take care of her. And I was asking Ed, what do you suggest I do? Because this guy doesn't know anything about what he's been thrown into. And he goes, well, you should check out this book, When Caregiving Calls. So I sent him a copy. He gave me great feedback. And I think it's really good that you went through and put that out there. But you want to share a little bit about yourself and just how that book came about?
Thanks, Brian. I really appreciate that you shared the book with your friend and that they found it helpful. And I haven't yet had a chance to read Ed's revised book, but I'm super excited about it. I loved his first edition of The Soul of Caregiving. And as I was reading his book, I could just tell this was a gentle soul who was really, really seeking to care for the caregiver. And his use of words, there are places in that book that are like poetry, in my opinion. And I'm just so appreciative of Ed's work, and just being able to be here tonight to support him, and also that he's asked me to join him in this little promotion with the books. So thank you, Ed. So I found myself as a family caregiver at a relatively young age, and I had a young family. I was working in national healthcare policy at the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services when my mother-in-law got a brain tumor, and she was given a very short time to live by the doctors, and that led us to become family caregivers. We took care of her for 5.5 years, and our lives were upended. I was totally unprepared for that, but ultimately that led me to change the course of my career. I left CMS and became a home care company owner, and worked with thousands of families that were like mine, that were caring for aging loved ones with chronic health conditions, loved ones who were dying, and also went back to school and got a doctoral degree and studied caregiving as a phenomenon of social science. So my book is really a result of all of that experience, not only as a family caregiver, but also professionally, pragmatically running a business of caregiving, and as a researcher studying caregiving. And it was really the research that started to open my eyes to the underlying psychological, social, relational challenges that caregivers face. And so when Caregiving Calls is really a succinct, concise guide to a lot of the social dynamics of caregiving that happen in a family caregiving situation. And my doctoral degree is in learning. And at the end of each chapter of the book, there are some questions that are designed to prompt the caregiver to think more deeply about their experience and to learn through intentional reflection how they can improve their lives for themselves and for their loved ones.
So if someone's looking for a manual of caregiving, this would be one of the resources you could hand to them. Like, there is no manual for caregiving, right? For family caregiving.
Well,
you're not put through school for it. I mean, where do you go?
Correct. You don't get a handbook. The one thing that I would say about that, Brian, is there was a person who reviewed my book on Amazon, and they gave me a 2-star review, and they said, well, this book doesn't say anything about how to help with the tasks that my loved one needs, like feeding them when they don't want to eat. And I was like, well, that's true. This book is not about the physical tasks of caregiving, because the physical tasks of caregiving are totally dependent upon the needs of the care receiver, and they vary widely from one person to another. When Caregiving Calls really is more about the psychosocial aspects of caregiving and the relationship aspects of caregiving and how things will change and evolve over time.
Right, between you and the loved one. And that's what I think
Yeah.
was a dramatic shift for my friend and his now wife, is their relationship was completely different. Like, he was in a much different role. And she's also someone who doesn't want to take help from anyone. She's talk about drilled into her that, I'm fine. And, she's on that opposite end, and she's been a caregiver. She was a teacher. And it's a horrible, it doesn't have to be horrible, right? I mean, that's the whole idea.
Right.
It can be a beautiful experience. You do not want the last couple of years of your life with someone to be a miserable experience. That's the worst outcome.
And I really do believe that that's something that the research overlooks is the rewards of caregiving. Mm-hmm. Many caregivers, many family caregivers report deep, meaningful rewards in the role. but all of the research focuses on the burden and the stress and the compassion fatigue and things like that. But if you want to know the rewards of caregiving, ask the caregivers, and they'll give you some poignant, profound insights about how caregiving has helped them to find a deeper meaning and purpose in life, how it's improved their relationship with their loved one, how it's changed their view of themselves and the world. It can be really remarkable.
I'd love to hear you interview some of the caregivers that have experienced that. Like, I don't know if my friend Kyle, if that would be the conversation we'd have, but it would make me feel better about things to know that there is a positive outcome to everything that's happening.
Yeah, Aaron, that's your second book. That's
I don't know.
This is the first one.
Oh, thanks, Ed. Yep.
And Aaron heard me give a talk, and we just connected, and we developed this friendship to trust and support each other. And it's really a pleasure for me to be able to have this bundle of my book and your book together, that we can offer that, to those who need help.
Excellent. Well, we've got about 10 minutes to go, so I want to open it up to questions from anyone else. Comments. You guys, we had a little conversation before on some interesting topics that I'm sure would be worth going into again, but I'll open it up. You guys all are unmuted, or you may have to unmute yourself if you're muted.
Yeah. I have a question. I'd like to know, how many of you have served in the military?
Not me. Sorry, Wally.
It's not a sorry. It's just another supporting Ed and Aaron's as well, their conversations. Not to simplify, but what we're talking about is old habits. And in the military, in most public safety professions, do not trust anyone. But my work in this industry is from an evidence-based practice known as the Wellness Recovery Action Plan. Acronym is WRAP, developed by Dr. Mary Ellen Copeland back in 1997. And it is a privilege to be a part of that organization. Today, they are the #1 in mental wellness. Too often, like Ed was saying, tough it up. I'm a Marine from the Vietnam era. And we have seen law enforcement agencies use RAP to break the paradigm, don't trust anyone. I believe that there would be a paradigm shift in terms how what we would call in the archetypal world, the ruler, in becoming a benevolent ruler rather than the lowest aspect of a ruler, narcissist, and other characters. So I'm very happy to hear of Ed's book. I think it's supporting the evidence-based practices that's out there, that we need a significant shift in how we have relationships with ourselves and with others. And that's the good news. We can learn new habits.
Thank you, Wally. That's good. And yes, being aware that this is coming, because I don't think any of us are going to get out of this life without a caregiver, being thrust into caregiving at some point in our lives, right? You think this is something, I mean, you don't consider it, but it's probably ultimately, if you have parents, you are going to be thrust into this role at some point to some degree, and acknowledging it now instead of dealing with all the things that come later are key. So thank you, Wally.
Yeah, Karen, Carol has her hand up.
And then Dennis.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks. I want to do one comment on combining what Wally talked about and what you talked about, Edward, especially with the military. One of the groups that I do pro bono coaching is for post-PTSD veterans. And talk about a group of people who don't know, one, reflective thinking, and two, how to ask for help. And it took me a couple of years being a coach to actually learn how to teach reflective thinking. So Wally, I'm going to look up your link and make a recommendation to, if they don't already know about your work with RAP, to the federal agency that refers coaches to me or coaching clients to me from the military. So thank you very much. But my practical question for you, Edward, is I wanted to know if you had any recommendations I read your book, your first edition of the book. Do you have any recommendations of how to read the second edition? Should I just start again from the beginning, or what? Just your thoughts there.
I would go through the table of contents and I would look to find out what speaks to you and start at that chapter.
Start at that chapter.
Also, getting back to Brian about the caregivers, on page 184 of the new book is a story between Benjamin and Elliot. And they're two twin brothers who one becomes a caregiver and one needs to be taken care of. And they have to learn what that means. You know, one thought, oh, it's easy for me to be a caregiver. And then he has difficulty. And the other says, oh, I'm independent, rough, tough cream puff. You know, I don't need any help. And he has to realize he does need help. So it's a story that if someone was saying, I have difficulty in letting go or just acknowledging what a caregiver feels, I would say, read that story. It's in chapter 9. So I would basically say, in the new book, what's really exciting is that we added lines with the questions. So you can actually journal in the book.
Yeah, you kind of combine the journal that we had separately in the book itself.
You know, it becomes a journal too, that you allow yourself to.
It's more like a workbook now.
A workbook. So, yeah, and we both, you know, as we were considering doing the questions on one particular page, I said, let's put lines in. So it's right there. So, Dennis, you wanna? Is that okay, Carol?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, and just to what you just said, Ed, I've done that with one book on writing myth, and what I love about that in the imagination is that it makes your book never completed, because people who read it and work some of these questions are in effect completing it on another level. So it has an organic quality for your having done that. But that's the observation. But the one that I am intrigued by is we've been talking about the conscious and the imaginal level. And Wally kind of cracked things open a little bit with the archetypal realm. There must be a way to use dreams of caregivers to further facilitate their own reflections on what's taking place in them. And it seems like the dream stories are maybe an untapped resource for caregivers. So it's yeah, and maybe if I turn that around into a question, Ed, and others, what do you think about opening the dreamscape up in this conversation of, and Ed, the word soul in your title is, takes me into that dreamscape and to that place of the unconscious. What's taking place in the unconscious that might be beneficial to excavate to a degree, that might add another layer to the caregiver's understanding. So that's where I am.
No, I can't agree with you more. Your dreams you might have nightmares. Your dreams will bring up issues. Your dreams will also bring up, a sense of gratitude and confidence in what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's another unexplored level of using dreams for self-care.
Yeah.
And there are
Good.
many people out there that are dream experts that can give some information about that.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Ed, very much.
Well, Dennis, what I do first thing every morning is I reflect on the day events prior. So for the first 30 minutes of the day, I just write, and it helps me process what happened either the night, some of it is dreams. Some of it is probably waking hours before that. I'm just basically, I feel very incomplete if I don't process what happened yesterday the next morning. And a lot of it is just, and it's oftentimes reading something that helps me like relate to what's happening. I think Aaron and Ed's books can help.
Yeah.
You're going through this caregiving experience, processing what's happening, and is extremely valuable, but you got to write. I think I've heard again and again that writing is such an important form of therapy that is, it's just essential that we get it out of our conscious, our unconscious.
Yeah, I share that with you, Brian. I've been doing that for 30 years.
Yeah.
The first thing I write in my journal in the morning after I light a candle and settle down with a cup of coffee is that I sit quietly with my journal and I ask, what from yesterday wants to be remembered?
Mm.
And it takes about 10 seconds if it's a slow morning. And then I just write whatever surfaces. So I love the fact that we share that imaginal realm, and others of you may also.
I call it my daily reintegration.
Yeah, very nice.
It's another form of self-care and learning how normal reflection is.
Yes.
It's not that most people don't reflect, they don't know that they are reflecting.
That's good, Ed. Thank you.
Well, we're right at an hour, kind of respecting everybody's time. We're right at dinner time. Daniel, did you want to say anything? You are probably closest to this material than anyone else.
Well, I
just share maybe about your experience that, like Ed said, you went through a lot as you edited his book. I mean, you really rewrote a lot of it, right?
It was a very immersive process, I will say. I was really in the midst of it. It was, I would say, different than anything I've ever edited before. I mean, I've never edited a book. I've edited dissertations and psychological reports and also very short articles and documents. But yeah, there was a lot of it where I think I had to balance my own kind of editing sense and my own writerly intuition and making sure Ed's voice didn't get lost in what I was doing. And there are just so many people in the book. Like there are just so many stories and there are so many ideas and so many theorists and saints and prophets. And so it's like you just get to a certain point where you just accept it's like its own little world. And my recommendation actually for Carol, I was going to say you should just read it from the beginning because I think Dennis has a new introduction, Ed has a new introduction. I mean, there's a lot of new material. So you can go the intuitive route, or you can just start from the beginning. But yeah, it was very interesting things, I will say, happened that from time to time would correspond with what was going on in my own life, where I would be editing a chapter about caretaking, and then I would end up, on a trip with someone who was in a caregiving role that was sort of becoming a caretaker and not a caregiver. And so there was a lot of really interesting mirroring that happened in my own lived experience with what was going on in the book.
Very cool. Well, and a good editor, I mean, is a good validation for, and I don't know, Aaron, if you had a similar experience with your editor, but they'll basically take your words and make you sound better than you did before. And you read them, you're just like, wow, I'm really good. But it was only because you had an editor. If you didn't have that editor, you're not so good. And an editor is really a crucial part of the team. And too many clients come to me with a book that hasn't been edited yet. And I'm just like, in today's world, you cannot release a book and expect to be successful at it if it has not had a good editor. So kudos to you for driving Ed down that route.
Thank you.
Daniel is going for his doctorate in clinical psychology at Pacifica. And what's so interesting is in the course of our discussions back and forth, and he realizes, what he really loves doing is helping others write. And it's so interesting that as a caregiver himself, he understands the importance of the story and how that has to be pulled apart and listened to. And I would not have been able to have this meeting today unless Daniel helped me. So I'm very, very appreciative of his insights and playing with this. He said, Ed, I think we should throw that out. And I'm, oh, okay. Well, maybe let's look at it, Oh, well, how about rephrase? Oh, yeah, okay, we'll rephrase it. So we went back and forth. But there were some things he left out, and I'm really glad he did. I tend to go, as I'm doing now, go on and on and on and on and on. So
Ed, you need an editor right now. Okay, we're over an hour. Is there any last words you want to say? As your Zoom editor, I'm going to close this meeting.
I just simply want to say thank you, everyone, for coming. You're really close friends, and I appreciate your support in this new endeavor, wherever it goes. And keep me in your thoughts and prayers, and also any lead you have to open up this paradigm, I'd appreciate. So thank you so much.
Warm
you,
congratulations, Ed.
Guys,
Beautifully
Great
done.
work.
And wonderful to meet you all.
You too,
Yeah, nice
Dennis.
to meet all of you.
Congratulations, Ed.
Thanks very much.
Well done. Well done.
Yeah.
Congrats to Aaron and Ed.
Yes.
And it's nice to meet the wonderful people on this Zoom.
Thank you, Wally. Good contribution.
Yeah. Great evening and great discussion.
Yeah, it was.
Bye all.
Bye.
Bye,
Bye.
everybody.